In the spring of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev assumed the mantle of General Secretary at a moment when the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of economic ruin. Inflation surged, grain harvests faltered, and the weight of an aging industrial complex strained every facet of daily life. Conventional wisdom among hardline officials warned that any deviation from strict central planning would unleash chaos. Gorbachev, however, saw a different path. He convened the Politburo and announced Perestroika Plus, a sweeping reform package that went far beyond the modest adjustments of his predecessor's policies. The program granted limited private ownership of small-scale enterprises, introduced market mechanisms for agricultural production, and opened selected sectors to foreign joint ventures. Crucially, it paired these economic liberties with a new legal framework designed to protect property rights while preserving the Communist Party's guiding role. The reformist Communist Party, a coalition of technocrats and progressive Marxists, championed the changes as necessary for the survival of socialism in an increasingly interconnected world. Opposition coalesced quickly around the hardline Soviet Guard, whose members feared that market incentives would erode ideological purity and empower Western interests. Their protests manifested in heated debates within party congresses, a surge of editorial warnings in state newspapers, and occasional street demonstrations in Moscow's industrial districts. Yet Gorbachev's resolve held firm. He leveraged his personal authority and the urgent need to avert famine and mass emigration to push the legislation through. The first months after Perestroika Plus saw modest but measurable shifts. A wave of cooperatives sprang up in the Baltic republics. Factories began experimenting with profit-sharing schemes, and foreign firms from West Germany and Japan secured joint venture contracts for microelectronics production in Siberia. Production data indicated a 3% rise in output across these pilot sectors, a small spark that hinted at a larger transformation. The Soviet leadership recognized that the reforms were not a panacea. They required careful calibration, vigilance against corruption, and an ongoing dialogue with the hardliners who still commanded significant influence within the armed forces and the KGB. By 1988, the ripple effects of Perestroika Plus had reached the outer edges of the Eastern Bloc. East Germany's economy, long propped up by Soviet subsidies, struggled under the weight of stagnation. Popular discontent manifested in spontaneous protests that echoed the earlier demonstrations of Prague and Budapest. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of division for over 3 decades, trembled under the pressure of both internal unrest and an increasingly assertive West German government seeking reunification. Gorbachev faced a stark choice: allow the wall's collapse to unfold without Soviet oversight, risking a chaotic power vacuum, or intervene decisively to shape a negotiated settlement that would preserve strategic interests while avoiding bloodshed. Guided by his belief that socialism could coexist with market elements, he opted for diplomacy. In late 1988, Soviet diplomats convened an unprecedented summit in Geneva, bringing together leaders from the German Democratic Republic, the Federal Republic of Germany, and representatives of the Western Alliance. The resulting agreement, later termed the Berlin Accord, established a framework for a gradual reunification that respected the political realities on both sides. The East German government retained a degree of autonomy over its economic transition, receiving targeted Soviet investments to modernize its industrial base. In exchange, Berlin agreed to maintain a joint security commission in which the USSR held a veto on any deployment of NATO forces east of the Elbe River for at least 10 years. The Berlin pivot proved pivotal. The negotiated reunification avoided the violent clashes that could have ignited broader instability across Central and Eastern Europe. Moreover, it demonstrated that a reformed Soviet Union could act as a constructive mediator rather than an imperialist aggressor. The West, surprised by Moscow's willingness to compromise, responded with a series of confidence-building measures: reduced arms deployments in Europe, increased cultural exchanges, and the opening of new trade corridors through the Baltic Sea. A revitalized Soviet economy, buoyed by market reforms and foreign investment, soon turned its gaze skyward. In 1990, under the leadership of a newly appointed Minister of Cosmonautics, the USSR announced the Commercial Orbital Initiative, KOI, a program designed to harness private capital for space exploration and satellite deployment. The COI marked a departure from the purely state-funded, prestige-driven missions of the Cold War era. The initiative invited joint ventures with Western aerospace firms, notably a partnership with an American company specializing in reusable launch technology. Together, they developed the Soyuz X launch vehicle, capable of delivering payloads to low Earth orbit at a fraction of previous costs. The first commercial satellite, an Earth observation platform designed for agricultural monitoring, was launched in 1992 and quickly proved its value to both Soviet collective farms and European agribusinesses. The competition with NASA and ESA was no longer one of ideological dominance, but of market share, reliability, and technological innovation. By the mid-1990s, the Soviet commercial launch sector captured approximately 30% of global satellite launches, rivaling the United States private firms such as SpaceX. The influx of revenue from orbital services fed back into research and development, spawning advances in lightweight composites, autonomous docking systems, and cryogenic propulsion. The new space race also carried a diplomatic dimension. Joint missions to the International Space Station, now a truly multinational enterprise, became symbols of cooperation rather than confrontation. Astronauts from Moscow, Houston, Paris, and Bangalore worked side by side, conducting experiments that benefited all participating nations. The Soviet Union's ability to compete commercially reinforced its claim that a socialist market economy could deliver cutting-edge technology without sacrificing ideological principles. While the superpowers negotiated their new relationship, the Global South observed with growing interest. Nations long marginalized in the bipolar contest sought an alternative path, one that did not require alignment with either Washington or Moscow. By 1995, India, Brazil, and South Africa, each having undergone its own internal reforms, convened a summit in New Delhi to discuss deeper cooperation. The outcome was the Non-Aligned Coalition, NAC, a political and economic bloc committed to fostering an independent development model that blended market mechanisms with state-led strategic planning. The coalition established a shared trade agreement, created a joint development bank, and coordinated positions at United Nations forums. Its charter emphasized respect for sovereignty, technology transfer, and equitable access to natural resources. The emergence of the NAC altered global dynamics. It offered developing countries a third option, reducing the pressure to choose between the Western Alliance's liberal democracy model and the Soviet social market approach. The coalition's growing economic clout, driven by Brazil's agricultural exports, India's IT services, and South Africa's mineral wealth, prompted both superpowers to engage more constructively with its members. For the USSR, the NAC represented a fertile ground for exporting its reformed model. Joint ventures in renewable energy, especially wind farms on the Brazilian coast and solar projects in India's arid zones, were financed through Soviet capital combined with local expertise. These collaborations reinforced Moscow's image as a partner rather than a patron, further cementing the multipolar architecture of world affairs. The turn of the millennium brought a new frontier: cyberspace. The rapid expansion of the Internet threatened to become another arena of ideological rivalry, as Western corporations pushed proprietary standards while Soviet technologists advocated open, state-supported protocols that could safeguard national security and promote equitable access. In 2001, after months of behind-the-scenes negotiations, the United States and the USSR signed the bilateral Digital Accord. The agreement established joint standards for core Internet infrastructure routing, addressing, and encryption that would be adopted by both blocs. It also created a framework for cross-border data centers, enabling companies to store information in multiple jurisdictions while complying with each nation's privacy regulations. The impact was immediate. Cybersecurity incidents that previously sparked diplomatic crises fell dramatically as shared protocols facilitated rapid coordinated responses. Joint ventures blossomed. A Russian firm and an American startup co-developed a cloud platform tailored for scientific research, offering low-cost compute cycles to universities across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Meanwhile, the NAC leveraged these standards to build its own digital backbone, reducing dependence on Western bandwidth providers. Digital détente did not erase competition, it merely reshaped it. The United States continued to champion a free market internet ecosystem, while the Soviet Union promoted a model where strategic sectors, energy grids, transportation networks, and critical communications remained under state oversight but operated within an interoperable global framework. This coexistence allowed both sides to reap economic benefits while containing the most destabilizing aspects of cyber warfare. Energy has always been the lifeblood of geopolitics, and in this revised timeline, it became a catalyst for further balance. The Soviet Union, having stabilized its economy, turned its attention to modernizing its vast energy infrastructure. Massive investments were directed toward Arctic offshore extraction, where advances in drilling technology, spurred by the new space race's materials research, made previously inaccessible reserves viable. Simultaneously, Moscow pursued an ambitious renewable agenda. By 2005, a network of high-capacity transmission lines linked Siberian wind farms to European markets via undersea cables crossing the Barents Sea. Solar arrays in Central Asia fed power into a continental supergrid that reduced reliance on fossil fuels throughout Eurasia. The Soviet state-owned energy conglomerate partnered with Indian and Brazilian firms to export turbine technology, creating a market for clean energy that transcended traditional geopolitical blocs. These developments shifted global energy flows away from the Middle East's oil-centric dominance. While petroleum remained essential for transportation, its share of world primary energy consumption fell below 30% by 2010. The diversification of supply reduced the leverage previously held by oil-rich nations and contributed to a more stable price environment. The United States, recognizing the strategic implications, accelerated its own offshore wind projects along the Atlantic seaboard and invested heavily in battery storage research. Yet rather than entering into direct confrontation over resources, both superpowers found common ground in climate accords that mandated emission reductions and encouraged technology sharing, a continuation of the collaborative spirit first evident in the Berlin Accord. With economic and technological foundations solidified, the contest between governance models shifted to the realm of ideas. Africa and Southeast Asia became arenas where Western liberal democracy and the Soviet social market approach vied for influence. The United States promoted multi-party elections, private entrepreneurship, and a limited welfare state as pathways to prosperity. Moscow, on the other hand, highlighted its hybrid system, market incentives coupled with robust public provision of health, education, and housing. In Kenya, a coalition government adopted a mixed economy blueprint inspired by Soviet reforms, securing loans from Moscow's Development Bank to build rail links and affordable housing projects. The program emphasized community ownership of small enterprises while maintaining state control over strategic industries such as telecommunications. In exchange, Kenyan students received scholarships to study engineering in Russian universities, fostering a cadre of professionals aligned with the social market ethos. Conversely, Vietnam deepened its partnership with Washington, attracting venture capital for a burgeoning tech sector centered on Ho Chi Minh City's Silicon River. The nation embraced deregulation and intellectual property protections that mirrored Western standards, positioning itself as a hub for multinational corporations seeking access to Southeast Asian markets. The ideological contest was not fought with propaganda alone, it manifested in concrete outcomes. Nations that adopted the Soviet-inspired model reported higher indices of social welfare, lower infant mortality, greater universal education coverage, but sometimes lagged in rapid private sector growth. Those leaning toward the Western model experienced faster GDP expansion but faced widening income inequality. Both superpowers learned to respect these trade-offs, adjusting their diplomatic outreach accordingly. Aid packages were increasingly conditional on measurable progress in governance reforms rather than strict ideological conformity. This nuanced competition underscored a world where ideas could coexist, intersect, and evolve without precipitating existential conflict. By 2020, the global system had settled into a delicate equilibrium. The United States and the Soviet Union, though still rivals, managed their differences through institutionalized crisis management mechanisms established in earlier accords. Yet both economies showed signs of slowdown. Aging populations, strained pension systems, and the relentless push for technological innovation exposed structural bottlenecks. Recognizing these shared challenges, leaders from Washington, Moscow, and the non-aligned coalition convened a summit in Geneva titled The Summit on Sustainable Prosperity. Over 10 days, negotiators drafted a set of protocols aimed at preventing accidental escalation and fostering coordinated responses to systemic risks, financial contagion, climate-induced migration, and cyber threats. Key provisions included an automatic notification system for large-scale financial interventions, joint monitoring teams for critical infrastructure in the Arctic and space sectors, and a shared research fund dedicated to next-generation energy storage. The summit also established a rotating chairmanship for a global stability council, ensuring that no single power could dominate decision-making. The agreements were hailed as a milestone, but they also laid bare underlying strains. The Soviet economy, despite its reforms, grappled with inefficiencies in state-run enterprises that resisted full market integration. The United States faced political polarization that hampered swift policy implementation. The non-aligned coalition, while growing economically, struggled to maintain cohesion among members with divergent national interests. As the episode draws to a close, we are left contemplating the nature of this alternate world, a reality where a bold turn in 1985 prevented collapse, where cooperation and competition coexisted, and where the balance of power is maintained not by dominance, but by continuous negotiation. The story reminds us that history is never inevitable. It is shaped by choices, compromises, and the willingness to envision a different future. In reflecting on this divergent timeline, we see both hope and caution. Economic reform can preserve stability without erasing identity. Diplomatic flexibility can transform potential crises into opportunities for partnership. Yet every system remains vulnerable when complacency replaces vigilance. The lesson is clear. The path to peace is fragile, requiring constant care, dialogue, and an understanding that the stakes of tomorrow are forged by the decisions we make today.